There is a moment in the winter of 1098 that the men who survived it would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. They had marched 2,000 miles. They had buried their brothers in the mountains of Anatolia and watched their horses fall one by one on roads of stone and dust. They had come, they believed, to do the work of God, and then on a cold night outside a small Syrian town called Ma'ara, hunger took them to a place no prayer could reach. What happened there was written down, plainly, by the very men who marched under the cross. They did not hide it, they could not, and 900 years later, it remains one of the most disturbing episodes ever recorded in a Christian chronicle. This is the story of how an army of pilgrims, starving in the dark, crossed a line that history has never been able to forgive. To understand how they got there, you have to understand what they had already endured. In the autumn of 1095, Pope Urban II had stood before a crowd in the French city of Clermont and called for an armed pilgrimage to the east. The Holy Land, he said, had fallen under foreign rule. Christians who took up the journey would have their sins washed away. The response was overwhelming. Across Europe, knights and farmers, lords and beggars sewed crosses onto their tunics and set out for a place most of them could not have found on a map. They called themselves pilgrims. We remember them as the First Crusade. Even before the great lords set out, a first wave had already gone ahead and had already perished. In the spring of 1096, thousands of common folk, stirred by wandering preachers, rushed eastward without training, without supplies, without any real plan beyond faith. They were farmers and laborers and their families, whole villages emptied by a single promise. Most of them never reached Asia at all, and those who did were cut to pieces almost as soon as they crossed into hostile territory. Their bones lay bleaching in the hills as a warning to everyone who came after. The men who marched in the main armies knew this. They knew the road they had chosen had already swallowed countless souls. And still they went, because they believed that heaven itself was watching, and that to turn back was to be damned forever. It is impossible to understand Ma'ara without understanding that conviction. It was the thing that gave these people the strength to endure the unendurable. It may also have blinded them to how far they were being pushed. What none of them understood in those first hopeful months was the sheer scale of the suffering ahead. The journey to the east was not a single march, but a slow, grinding ordeal that lasted years. They crossed the Balkans in the heat of summer. They waited outside the walls of Constantinople, where the emperor watched these ragged Westerners with open suspicion. Then they passed into Asia Minor, and the land itself began to take them apart. The march across Anatolia was a horror that few had imagined. The Turks had emptied the countryside before them, burning crops and poisoning wells. Under a sun that gave no mercy, men drank from puddles and chewed on thorns. Horses collapsed beneath their riders and were left where they fell. Knights who had owned fine war horses in France now walked on foot, or rode oxen, or carried their armor on their own backs. People died of thirst within sight of their companions, and there was nothing anyone could do but keep walking. By the time the army reached northern Syria, it was no longer the proud host that had set out from Europe. It was a column of exhausted, half-starved survivors held together by faith and fear. And then came Antioch. The great city of Antioch, with its enormous walls and its towers stretching up the mountainside, became the site of one of the longest and most brutal sieges of the entire campaign. For more than 7 months, the Crusaders sat outside those walls through the autumn and the bitter winter. Rain turned their camp into a swamp. Food ran short and then ran out. The chroniclers describe men boiling leather and eating the bark of trees. They described the wealthy selling everything they owned for a single loaf of bread. Many simply gave up and slipped away in the night, abandoning the cause and the army both. Those who stayed grew thin as skeletons, their faith hardening into something desperate. When Antioch finally fell, in the early summer of 1098, there was barely time to celebrate before a massive Turkish relief army arrived to trap the Crusaders inside the very city they had just taken. Now the besiegers became the besieged. Starvation closed in again, and it was here, in their darkest hour, that a poor pilgrim claimed to have found a holy relic buried beneath a church floor, a fragment of the lance that had pierced the side of Christ. Whether anyone truly believed it, the discovery lit a fire in the starving army. They poured out of the gates and against all reason shattered the Turkish force. Antioch was theirs, but the victory came at a terrible cost, and not only in blood. The leaders of the crusade, the great princes who had set out together, now fell to quarreling over who should rule the conquered city. Months passed. The men grew restless. They had not come all this way to watch their lords squabble over a prize. They had come for Jerusalem, the city at the center of the world, still hundreds of miles to the south. And as the autumn of 1098 wore on, the ordinary soldiers began to demand, with growing anger, that the march continue. It was in this poisoned mood, with the army divided and the leaders distrustful of one another, that one of the princes turned his attention south, toward a town that lay across the road to Jerusalem. Its name was Ma'arat al-Numan. To the Crusaders it was simply Ma'ara. It was not a great fortress like Antioch. It was a modest, prosperous market town, ringed by a wall, home to merchants and farmers and scholars. It had no army to speak of, but it stood in the way, and it was rumored to hold grain and supplies. To men who had spent 2 years on the edge of starvation, the promise of full storehouses was reason enough. The Crusaders arrived before the walls of Ma'ara in late November. The townspeople, who had heard what these Westerners had done to other cities, shut their gates and prepared to defend themselves as best they could. They had no professional soldiers, only ordinary men climbing onto the ramparts with whatever they could find. From the walls they hurled stones and beehives down onto the attackers. They shouted insults. They held for a time against an enemy far more experienced in the grim arts of siege. But the Crusaders had done this before. They built a great wooden siege tower, tall enough to overlook the walls, and rolled it slowly toward the town. From its upper platform, knights could fight the defenders on equal footing while others worked below, digging at the base of the wall, prying out the stones one by one. The people of Ma'ara fought through the day and into the night. They could see what was coming. They knew that if the wall broke, there would be no mercy. For days, the great tower loomed over the town like a thing out of a nightmare. The defenders tried everything to stop it. They flung stones and fire, ropes and grappling hooks, anything that might topple it or set it alight. But the Crusaders pressed on with the patience of men who had taken far greater cities than this. Under the cover of the tower, engineers crept to the base of the wall and began the slow, deliberate work of pulling it apart, one stone at a time, while above them the fighting never ceased. The people of Ma'ara had no relief coming. No army was marching to save them. They were alone, ordinary townsfolk standing against one of the most hardened fighting forces of the age. And they must have known, as the light failed each evening, that the time they had left was almost gone. It broke. After roughly 2 weeks of siege, in the second week of December, the Crusaders forced their way into the town. What followed was a massacre. The chroniclers, even though sympathetic to the crusade, do not pretend otherwise. The men who had marched 2,000 miles in the name of God fell upon the townspeople of Ma'ara and slaughtered them through the streets and in their homes. Thousands perished in a single night and the day that followed. Those who tried to surrender, who had been promised their lives in exchange for hiding their valuables, were not spared. The Crusaders tore the town apart looking for the treasure they were certain it must contain. And here the story turns from cruelty, which the medieval world knew well, into something stranger and far more terrible. Because when the killing was done, and the soldiers searched the captured town for the food they had been promised, they found almost nothing. The storehouses were not overflowing. There was no great cache of grain to fill the bellies of an army of thousands. The town that was supposed to save them had nothing left to give. It was now the depths of winter. The leaders of the crusade, still consumed by their rivalry, refused to move the army on toward Jerusalem. They lingered for weeks, arguing, while their men sat in the ruins of Ma'ara with no food and no purpose. The men who should have led them had names that would echo through the whole history of the crusade. Raymond of St. Gilles, the powerful Count of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto, the ambitious Norman who had seized Antioch for himself, were locked in a contest of wills that neither would surrender. Each wanted the prizes of conquest for himself. Each suspected the other of betrayal. And while they maneuvered and bargained and refused to give ground, the army that had bled for them was left to rot in the cold. To the starving soldiers it must have seemed a kind of madness that after everything they had survived, the thing standing between them and Jerusalem was not the enemy at all, but the vanity of their own commanders. In time their fury would boil over. According to several accounts, the common people of the army at last took matters into their own hands and began tearing down the walls of Ma'ara, themselves stone by stone, so that there would be nothing left worth quarreling over, and no reason for the lords to linger a single day longer. It was an act of pure desperation, and it worked. But it came far too late for many, and not before the darkest thing of all had already taken place. The weather turned bitter. Cold rain fell on the broken walls, and the same hunger that had stalked them at Antioch returned. But this time there was no relic to inspire them, no enemy army to charge, no city left to take. There was only the slow, grinding emptiness of starvation and the silence of leaders who would not lead. Imagine what those weeks were like. You have survived everything the world could throw at you. You have crossed deserts and mountains. You have watched friends die of thirst and disease and the sword. You believed, with everything in you, that God walked beside your army, and now you sit in the rubble of a town you destroyed, in the cold and the dark, and your own body is beginning to fail. Your strength is gone. Your face is hollow. The men around you no longer look like men. Day after day, the situation does not improve, because the people who could save it are too busy arguing over a crown. There is no bread. There is no grain. There is nothing to boil, nothing to chew, nothing left to sell. There is only the question that no one wants to ask aloud, the question that grows louder in the silence with each passing night. Hunger of this kind is not a single sensation. It comes in stages, and the men at Ma'ara knew them all. First the gnawing, the constant thought of food that crowds out every other thought. Then the weakness, the trembling in the hands, the way the world seems to tilt when you rise to your feet. Then the body begins to feed upon itself, drawing on muscle and fat until there is nothing left to draw on, and the face hollows and the eyes sink and the skin draws tight across the bone. The mind changes too. Judgment slips. The careful rules that govern ordinary life begin to feel distant, almost meaningless, set against the single overwhelming need that fills every waking hour. Add to this the cold of a Syrian winter in the open ruins, the rain that never seemed to stop, the sickness that always follows famine, and the bitter knowledge that their own commanders had abandoned them to all of it. These were not the conditions in which human beings make good choices. These were the conditions in which the floor falls away beneath everything a person ever believed about themselves. What we know about what happened next comes not from the enemies of the Crusade, but from its own scribes. 3 separate chroniclers who were part of the movement, or close to it, recorded the same dark truth. A priest named Raymond of Aguilers, who traveled with the army and wrote its history, set it down without flinching. So did Fulcher of Chartres. So did Radulph of Caen, who described it in the plainest possible terms decades later. Their accounts differ in the details, as accounts always do, but they agree on the central unbearable fact. In the starving camp at Ma'ara, the Crusaders turned to the bodies of the slain. They cut flesh from the corpses of the people they had killed, and in their desperation they ate it. The chroniclers struggle, in their own words, to make sense of it. Some try to soften it, to say it was only a few, that hunger had driven them mad, that they were not in their right minds. Raymond of Aguilers writes almost as if reporting a rumor too shameful to confirm, and yet he does not deny it. Radulph of Caen is more direct, more clinical, describing how the bodies were prepared. One account claims that some, beyond all reason, came to prefer it. Whatever the precise truth, the core of the matter survived every retelling. An army that had set out to sanctify itself in the eyes of God had ended up consuming human flesh in the ruins of a Syrian town. There is no way to read those passages and come away unshaken. And there is one more detail, recorded in several accounts, that makes the story darker still. Within the great mass of the crusading host, there was a group apart, a band of the very poorest pilgrims who had lost everything on the long road east. The chroniclers call them the Tafurs. They had no armor and no horses. They fought with clubs and knives and farm tools, with sharpened sticks and bare hands. They went barefoot and half-naked, caked in the filth of the march, and they were said to follow a leader who had once been a knight and had given up his rank to live among the destitute. The Tafurs were feared, and not only by the enemy. Even the Crusader lords were uneasy in their presence, for here were men who had been stripped of everything a person can lose, and who had nothing left to hold them back. And it is the Tafurs, more than anyone, whom the sources name when they describe what was done to the bodies at Ma'ara. Some chroniclers, anxious to protect the reputation of the noble knights, lay the act entirely upon these ragged outcasts, as if to say that it was the poor and the broken who crossed the line, and never the gentlemen of France. Whether that is the truth, or simply a story that was easier to live with, it tells us something about how deeply the memory disturbed the men who wrote it down. They needed someone to carry the blame. They needed the horror to belong to someone other than themselves. It is worth pausing here to understand how extraordinary it is that this was written down at all. The crusade was a holy enterprise. Its chroniclers were churchmen whose entire purpose was to present the expedition as blessed, as righteous, as the will of heaven made manifest. They had every reason in the world to bury this story, to leave it out, to let it vanish, and yet they did not. The thing that happened at Ma'ara was apparently so widely known, so impossible to conceal, that even the friendly historians of the crusade felt compelled to record it, however reluctantly. That is perhaps the most chilling detail of all. This was not propaganda invented by enemies, it was a confession. Why did it happen? Historians have argued about this for centuries. The simplest answer is the truest one. People who are starving to the very edge of death will do almost anything to survive, and the history of famine, in every age and on every continent, bears this out with grim consistency. The Crusaders at Ma'ara were not monsters who set out to do the unthinkable. They were ordinary human beings, pushed past the limits of endurance by years of suffering, and the failure of the men who were supposed to lead them. Their faith had told them they were doing something sacred. Their bodies told them only that they were dying. And in the gap between those two truths, something broke. It would be comforting to believe that Ma'ara was a singular horror, a unique stain on one army in one terrible winter. It was not. The grim truth, known to anyone who has studied the history of famine and siege, is that the same thing has happened again and again across the centuries, in every part of the world, wherever human beings have been pushed past the final edge of starvation. Besieged cities in the ancient world recorded it. Trapped expeditions in the frozen ages that followed recorded it. Famines that swept across whole regions recorded it, in words that echo the chronicles of Ma'ara almost exactly. The pattern is always the same. The food runs out, the help does not come. The days stretch on, and the body's demand grows louder than every law and every belief, until at last, the thing that should have been impossible becomes, for a desperate few, the only way to see another morning. It is not a comfortable thing to know about our own kind, but it is true, and the men at Ma'ara were simply one more chapter in a story far older and far more widespread than any of them could ever have imagined. But there may have been more to it than hunger alone. Some who study the period have suggested that the act carried a second purpose, beyond mere survival. The Crusaders had spent years being told they were instruments of holy terror, that the enemies of their faith should fear them. After Ma'ara, the story of what they had done spread quickly through the region, and it spread fear ahead of them like a shadow. Whether they intended it or not, the horror of Ma'ara became a weapon. Towns along the road to Jerusalem heard what these Westerners were capable of, and many chose to negotiate, to pay, to open their gates rather than face the same fate. The unthinkable, once committed, became a kind of dark reputation that traveled faster than any army. The town of Ma'ara itself was left in ruins. Before the Crusaders finally moved on, in their frustration and their rage, they tore down what remained of its walls and set parts of it to the torch. The people who had lived there, the merchants and the farmers and the scholars, were gone, scattered or slain. A community that had stood for centuries was erased in a matter of weeks, first by the sword and then by the slow horror of what came after. To this day, the memory of Ma'ara is preserved very differently on different sides of the old divide. In the Arabic sources, it stands as a symbol of senseless devastation. In the Western chronicles, it is a wound, a moment of shame that the authors could neither justify nor entirely look away from. When the army at last marched south, in January of 1099, it carried the memory of Ma'ara with it. The leaders had finally been forced to move, in part by the fury of their own men, who in some accounts began to tear down the walls of the town themselves, simply to deny their squabbling lords any reason to stay. The ordinary soldiers wanted Jerusalem. They had paid for it in a currency too terrible to name, and they would not be denied. Within 6 months, they would stand before the holy city itself, and there, in the summer heat, they would write another chapter of blood that the world has never forgotten. But that is a story for another day. What lingers about Ma'ara is not the politics, or the strategy, or even the massacre, terrible as it was. Massacres, the medieval world understood. What lingers is the quiet, the weeks of cold and silence in which an army of believers slowly came apart, and the choice that emerged from that silence. It is a window into something we prefer not to look at directly. The thin distance between who we believe ourselves to be and what we might become, if everything were taken from us. The Crusaders of Ma'ara were not so different from anyone else. They had families and prayers and dreams of going home. They believed they were good, and then the food ran out, and the winter closed in, and the men who should have helped them did nothing, and they discovered that the line they thought could never be crossed was thinner than they had ever imagined. That, in the end, is why we still remember a small Syrian town that fell more than 9 centuries ago. Not for its walls or its wealth, both long gone, but for what it revealed about the human beings who destroyed it. Hunger does not create monsters out of nothing. It strips everything else away until only the will to live remains, and then it asks a question that none of us can be certain we would answer well. The men who survived Ma'ara carried that question to their graves. They had marched for God across half the world, and in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of a ruined town, they had learned the most frightening truth a person can learn about themselves, that there is almost no limit to what a human being will do when the only other choice is to die. The chronicles closed the book on Ma'ara and moved on, eager to reach the triumph of Jerusalem. But the story stayed where it was, buried in those few unflinching lines, waiting. And if it teaches us anything across all these centuries, it is this. The people in the history books were not characters in a tale. They were as real as you are. They felt the cold the way you feel it. They feared the dark the way you do. And the things they did in their worst hour are not the deeds of strangers from a vanished world. They are a mirror held up across 900 years, asking each of us a question we can only hope we are never forced to answer.